everyone. We got a great one for you. As always, a jam-packed show. So much news to ingest. We have President Biden just making remarks on a crazy ruling where the Supreme Court essentially said presidents are immune if they are carrying out their official duties. This is in regards to a Trump election case, mostly regarding the Jack Smith special counsel prosecution regarding January 6th and the general efforts to overturn the results of the 2020 election. We'll break down what that means and also kind of take in the crazy weekend of what has just been one crazy Democratic meeting after another. We have the Biden's meeting. We have a chaotic donor call to talk about. So much stuff going on. Carl Bernstein now taking to CNN, talking about the incredible problems that are being faced by Biden with his senility and multiple kind of private events that we know about that did not go well. We are also going to be talking about some continuing reports about the situation in Israel, Netanyahu continuing the war, and ominous threat from Yoav Gallant about the future of the war against Hezbollah. And I've been holding off on it, but we will be going over the UK general election, which is coming up in just 3 days. And with me today to do all of that, I am so pleased to have Justin Weinstein. Justin, thank you so much for joining us here today.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited to get started.
All right, so really interesting, kind of an important stuff coming from President Biden today. We had a Supreme Court ruling. We'll kind of break down the nuts and bolts of it in a second, but pretty much what you need to know, the Supreme Court has ruled today on a case that was before it about presidential immunity. And when the president gets immunity under law, and essentially John Roberts kind of codified what I would say has been a pretty de facto precedent for quite a while in this country, which is essentially that presidents can have immunity if they say it is an official act. And really what is a pretty big power grab for the judiciary, and also, obviously is the executive as well, because the judiciary in this Roberts decision is going to be able to decide what constitutes an official act, which will be very, very important. But before we get into this, I don't want to go too long into Biden's speech. It was a pretty big moment. It was about 7 minutes long only. It was a pretty big moment in the context of the disastrous debate performance last Thursday. To see how he would look, how he would come out there. Came out, a lot of people are saying, and I'm no makeup expert, but apparently he had a lot of bronzer on. I think it's pretty obvious he had a lot of bronzer on. And he was relatively, cogent, relatively muted, and did not take any questions, even though there were, he didn't do his classic, slow motion turnaround with the, weird grin either as he was walking out the door. He made a clean exit. But without further ado, here's Biden's reaction to what many are saying is one of the most devastating, kind of Supreme Court blows, as they come blow after blow, really, for just general control over what the president can do in office.
There are no kings in America. Each of us is equal before the law. No one is above the law, not even the President of the United States. Today's Supreme Court decision on presidential immunity, that fundamentally changed. For all practical purposes, today's decision almost certainly means that there are virtually no limits on what a president can do. This is a fundamentally new principle, and it's a dangerous precedent, because the power of the office will no longer be constrained by the law, even including the Supreme Court of the United States. The only limits will be self-imposed by the president alone. This decision today has continued the court's attack in recent years on a wide range of long-established legal principles in our nation, from gutting voting rights and civil rights, to taking away a woman's right to choose, to today's decision that undermines the rule of law of this nation. Nearly 4 years ago, my predecessor sent a violent mob to the U.S. Capitol to stop the peaceful transfer of power We all saw it with our own eyes. We sat there and watched it happen that day. Attack on the police, the ransacking of the Capitol, a mob literally hunting down the House Speaker, Nancy Pelosi, gallows erected to hang the Vice President, Mike Pence. I think it's fair to say it's one of the darkest days in the history of America. Now the man who sent that mob to the U.S. Capitol is facing potential criminal conviction for what happened that day. And the American people deserve to have an answer in the courts before the upcoming election.
And so, yeah, he does kind of there in the end try and tie it back to Trump. He did say, which I found to be, pretty interesting, that this immunity decision here does go give a lot of power to the executive. Also does give a lot of power, again, to the Supreme Court, because they are going to be the ones, and, the lawyer or the judges of the specific trial, which could be the lower courts, could also be the Supreme Court, about what constitutes official and non-official act. The ruling, again, it makes this distinction, which, the acts that have immunity are the acts of a president, the official actions of a president, and those of a private citizen do not have immunity. So, if he can prove, that he did it as an official act, Trump, which is this speech, in the Capitol, for example, that they'll say, leading up to January 6th, they say, oh, that was an official act as president. He can get, immunity from that, or any of his calls that he made, the Find Me 11,000 votes call. That is probably the role that they're trying to go. The vote was 6-3, dividing along partisan lines. Its immediate practical effect will be to further complicate the case against Mr. Trump, with the chances that it will go before a jury ahead of the election, now vanishingly remote, and the charges against him, at a minimum, narrowed. The decision amounted to a powerful statement by the court's conservative majority that presidents should be insulated from the potential that actions they take in carrying out their official duties could be later used by political enemies to charge them with crimes. John Roberts wrote for the majority, saying Trump had at least a presumption of immunity, or at least presumptive immunity for his official acts. He added that the trial judge must undertake an intensive factual review to separate official and unofficial conduct and to assess whether the prosecutors can overcome the presumption protecting Trump for his official conduct. If Trump prevails at the polls, the issue could become moot, since he could order the Justice Department to just drop the charges. So there you go. And again, this is what I hate. This really dramatic rhetoric about the liberal wing, in some of the harshest dissents ever filed by the justices of the Supreme Court, said the majority had created a kind of king not answerable to the law. It's like you can write as much stinging dissents, describing in more flowy, prosy legalese about stuff that we already know, but I don't think it really helps too much. Just with regards to this, obviously I think it does complicate, unfortunately it does complicate the case for Trump. It probably would have been on the merits a pretty good case. It's going to be delayed yet again, although I do think it is kind of a reality that presidents, part of the job of being president is that if you do official acts, for example, you say you justify a drone strike like Biden did that killed, a family of like 17 people in Afghanistan. That is not something that you're going to be punished for, because if that happens, then it kind of makes the job pretty unappealing for a lot of other people who may want to run and be in that similar position. So this is just a kind of official acknowledgement of that, but it obviously could be used by Trump, could be used by even Biden to claim this doctrine, or really anybody, this doctrine, to really expand the powers of the president. Justin, I want to get your reaction to this ruling, and also want to get your thoughts about Biden's response to this. Is he the person who is going to be the best at or did he appropriately capture a lot of the the liberal rage that I've been seeing about the decision all day long online?
Yeah, so obviously I think it's it's a pretty. Some have called it a pretty dark day in the history of the Supreme Court. I, for one, I'm not very surprised, but obviously it is a monumental day, because the idea that former presidents can't be prosecuted for their official acts, that is something that's that's worth considering here. Obviously, as Sotomayor, writes in her dissent, the majority's line between official acts and unofficial acts is potentially blurry. The sort of intensive review that Roberts refers to, again, will require some future litigation, and that, that could I could see that resulting in some in some element of how should I put this, in some element of uncertainty, really, for future jurisprudence of the Supreme Court. And I think that, as far as it relates to Trump and, his, if he wins again, his future Justice Department, I share those concerns that you laid out. And yeah, I think that, there has been news saying, Richard Nixon might have wished this ruling
Yeah.
had applied to him or something. And I think, I think that a lot of that logic is sound, right? We see, if we think, okay, what is an official act? Is it just something that you do as president? Is it, just because you sign it as an executive order, or just because you make a speech in your capacity as president of the United States? Does that, insulate you from prosecution? And if you think about it, like with the Watergate tapes, for example, one might reasonably apply the logic of the court's reasoning today to that and wonder, if Nixon, was given a fair shake at things. And obviously, looking back at it, knowing, the impropriety of Nixon and his campaign at that time, that point obviously seems laughable, but that's the logical endpoint of where we are with the extreme logical endpoint of where we are with the court's decision today. I'll also, respond to that second piece, which is what you said about Biden's response. And, I also noticed that Biden was looking heavy on the bronze today. But I think that there was, and we'll get to that in a little bit, I'm sure. But I think that in terms of what Biden said, I did think that he gave a good response. I think that his logic of saying, it's incumbent in the power of the president not just to know when to use, when to use the full force of executive power, but to also know when to understand and to respect its limits. And I think that, Biden is, in my personal opinion, he's presenting himself as if he's doing, or as if he's going to do everything in his power to respect those limits himself. We can discuss the merits of that particular claim, but I also think that his tying back to Trump in the end, illuminated for viewers and listeners that, he really is concerned, that Trump, will abuse this ruling, and I share those concerns as well.
Yeah, I think a lot of people are, and it kind of, I feel like you find it in the questioning and the like the questions that you asked about. Would Richard Nixon be able to get off on this? How would it apply in other situations? And that is the kind of uncertainty that is, it's largely going to be decided by the court system. Which Biden was able to get some judges in the lower courts, but that's a pretty conservative court system over a long period of time. That we've seen have some pretty big effects, and I guess the case there is, what do we do about this? What is the kind of like the Democratic Party policy response, or just the Democratic movement in general, the Democratic side of the country, activists, all that stuff is how do you respond to that? And I think any kind of more vibrant movement probably would have been putting out a much more kind of coherent plan. And I think you do see some of the stuff about, it is very concerning about what Trump may do with this, and I think a lot of other people could be concerned. But then it's like, Biden is saying he's going to be respecting these limits. But I personally, I don't know about you, would have liked to see more of a kind of robust response. And maybe if you were Biden, like, what do you think that would have been?
Yeah, and I think so. I think that's a good point, and maybe a more robust response is obviously something that we all want from Biden at this point, and I'm not sure we'll get it, but for a multitude of reasons. But I think that there's could we have seen a potentially more forceful response, going after the court's conservative approaching supermajority? I would say we probably could have, but I also think that as we approach an election, he might, and his advisors in guiding what he's going to speak about, I think they potentially might have cautioned him away from really, really digging into digging into the makeup of the court. For example, there's been news recently about the potential corruption with Clarence Thomas. There's been news about Justice Alito and what he's been his ties. And I think that there's could we have seen forceful response from Biden that included criticism of those two justices in particular, and potentially how that's emblematic of a Supreme Court that's out of step and increasingly out of touch with not just the will of the American public, but also the norms of the Supreme Court that have had it last for the entirety of our nation's history. Sure, I think we could have seen that, but I also think that as election season approaches, and and Biden is trying to make himself sort of marketable to the independent voter at this point. I'm not sure that would have been or that I'm not sure I would have expected him at least to take that strategy, even though I potentially would have been interested in seeing it.
Yeah, I feel like it definitely would have been a very interesting strategy, and I think the big question is like, how is this going? And it's obviously impossible to predict with the future, but the big question is, how is this going to be used in the future? We've already kind of seen a bit of a hint of it, which is Trump trying to overturn his conviction, which actually was done before he was president. Like these hush money payments and this agreement for payments, like that story was out before the election with regards to Stormy Daniels, but. I think I could probably, kind of begin to hazard out. I think it really does depend on the person behind it, but I think we can definitely imagine scenarios where Democrats and Republicans now would be trying to, use this kind of official acts defense, like almost the same way, we had the Chevron defense up until last week. This was an official act, to use this defense, to really try and cover up various political, missteps or, kind of malpractice. But at the same time, it really is quite hard, for any other president other than Trump to really going to get prosecuted because, I think for a lot of reasons, for his general abnormality in kind of the context of all the presidents to come before him and, Biden that's come after him. He does seem like he is just almost a separate figure. So it really is kind of, a lot of different ways this could go. But if you had to, guess, and again, not trying to, put you on the spot with a prediction of the future, but do you see this being used in that kind of political way as almost kind of a, defense for a lot of these potentially controversial future presidential actions?
I mean, it's hard not to, right? I'm trying to imagine a point of respect. Let's say Trump, again, in this world where Trump wins. It's hard not to see him, trying to use that, or rather abuse this decision for his own personal benefit. And I think, it's definitely, in my view, more likely than not that, that we see something like that. But I'll also point out that this isn't the first time that the Supreme Court has ruled on issues like this. For example, there was a case in the late '90s, I believe '97, dealing with Bill Clinton at the time, stemming from allegations at the time when he was governor of Arkansas, the Democrat governor of Arkansas, over allegations that he had, that he'd sexually harassed Paula Jones. And I think that at the time, the Supreme Court had actually ruled that the Constitution didn't grant a sitting president immunity from civil litigation, except, and I have it here, under highly unusual circumstances. And I think that those, and that was a 9-0 decision. And you'll note that Clarence Thomas and Antonin Scalia, two famous conservatives on the Supreme Court bench at the time, they both voted in favor. And so I think that this, reading Trump v. U.S. in the context and in the light of precedent from Clinton v. Jones, even though this had to deal more with civil litigation and the president not being entitled to civil litigation, it's almost hard to see how a president presidential immunity from civil litigation. Or rather, there is not. The Constitution clearly does not allow, as the justices said, for presidential immunity from civil litigation. Yet somehow today we've decided that that it's a deep constitutional principle for the president to faithfully execute the laws, that he must be given immunity from criminal prosecution. Especially when we think about the Stormy Daniels stuff, which happened obviously before Trump entered his official capacity as president of the United States. And so I just find that I definitely find that incompatibility a little bit troubling.
Yeah. So it is definitely very interesting. So as we continue to see, the court essentially get crazier and crazier and kind of on the wrong side of American issues and a lot of things, as I kind of alluded to before, I think a lot of people would like to see, myself included, some sort of, more, kind of not even just rhetorical, but just kind of real political response from the Democrats, and just say, this is too far, kind of coalesce around some sort of fix for this stuff. And I think it does kind of portend to what we've seen a lot recently, which has been President Biden being really unable to kind of functionally just move the Democratic Party forward, put these kind of policies forward, and run what I would say has been a relatively normal campaign, and that has been really exemplified on the debate stage last Thursday night. First of all, I do kind of want to get your reaction to the debate, what you thought of it, and how it changed your perception, if at all, of Biden's campaign and his fitness to be president for 4 more years.
Absolutely. So I want to start off by saying I have a tremendous deal of respect for the president. I think his record's been strong. I think that he saved us in 2020 from the prospect of a consecutive Trump term. That said, if after Thursday night's debate we move forward as if everything is the same and nothing's changed, we're being unserious. Watching that debate, as he walked on the stage, and was greeting potential, his advisors or other folks in the audience, initially. Even though obviously it was a closed audience debate, but the folks that were actually there, you could just tell in his voice that he wasn't fully present, he wasn't fully there. And then obviously once the questions started to roll in and his answers, the notable one being when he was talking about abortion, which is supposed to be a very strong issue for the Democrats, he pivoted to a talking point that he had memorized about illegal immigration, and I think that potentially is emblematic of of Biden's really subpar performance. And it really, I think I've personally been very critical of calls to abandon Biden, whether it be over his, Israel-Gaza policy, over climate policy, over a whole litany of things. But I'm no longer going to pretend that I think he can win at the moment. And so I think, as much as I'm a Democrat, I plan on supporting him if he's the nominee. I no longer see a viable path forward. It really was, a strong mood shifter for me, as you had referenced, and how, again, I've been a Biden defender for so long, and I truly believe that he's a good, decent man. But if you were to ask me seriously and ask me to look you in the eye and say, can he be president for another 4 years? On top of the fact that he's president now and is dealing, the world is, there's plenty of situations going on in the world that require, a strong a president who's with it. I think that we'd be kidding ourselves if we think that he can last another 4 years as president of the United States. And so I was really disappointed, saddened about the debate performance. And yet I wonder what the path forward for Democrats looks like. Obviously, there's been some news over the weekend about Camp David and about the president's family urging him to stay in the race. And I'm sure we can get into that. Yeah.
Yeah, that is definitely among some of the many stories that have come out over the weekend. We saw the salvation plan begin to take place. This is the two Axios kingpins, Mike Allen and Jim Vandehei, talking about it. This was coming after a Camp David response. And apparently some of his, he had essentially a meeting with his family. Jill Biden seemed to want him to stay in. Hunter was apparently very strong in wanting to stay in. They all sat for a Vogue photo shoot with Annie Leibovitz, which had I think Joe Biden was on the front page with a very interesting title that could be interpreted either very harshly or very in good faith. With the title was, I think, was something along the lines of "We have the power to decide our future," and it all comes down to how wide you cast that net of we. Is it just the Biden family has the power to decide the future for everyone else, or do Democratic voters who have in every single poll said we think Biden is too old, we want another look at some other people. So that was very interesting. They apparently, according to the AP, were very insistent on him staying in, and there has been some continued kind of calls from the Biden side to assuage donors that we'll get into. And this is from the Axios. Biden, who's apparently been ducking tough interviews and avoiding, well, not apparently, we know he kind of has, avoided no-holds-barred press conferences. He's now considering both. And we've got to make sure it happens between 10 and 4 p.m. because sources have said that he is really only, he's at his best, shall we say, during those hours, which is really not a good sign when it comes to, think of, sundowning is like, I remember, as a card carrying member of the more left side of the Democratic Party, people making jokes about Biden sundowning back in the primaries now, and we see it just as he fights for a second term, it really coming to rear its ugly head yet again. Look for a town hall or big one-on-one interviews this month, they say, which is very, very interesting. So as they kind of have made the decision to come in, Biden essentially has no interest in dropping out. Biden friends and family blame longtime aides who had prepped Biden, which to me just is so pathetic, because it's just like he was in Camp David for a whole week before, they giving him every possible chance to remember this stuff, to practice, to have all these mock debates. He could go to bed at 6 p.m. if he wanted, and no one would know. To rest up and come out sharp for debate night on this past Thursday. But he was just unable to do it. And there were some times in that debate where you could see he kind of had an idea of what to say. But again, it was just the brain wasn't functioning as it would maybe 5-10 years ago. So he wasn't able to complete the sentence in a smooth way. The president apparently smoothed it over, called former chief of staff Ron Klain, who led the team. And one of the things they talked about is that neither he nor the family blames the prep, contrary to literally every single report that indicates the exact opposite that his family has been saying. Campaign spokesperson Kevin Munoz said the aides who prepped the president have been with him for years, often decades, seeing him through victories and challenges. He maintains strong confidence in them. So again, Ron Klain there is somebody who has taken a lot of flack for it, because he was in the room kind of preparing Biden the most for that. And it's just almost a line that, even though I've only really seen the most hardcore Biden stands, to use that term you use. The second debate is going to be on September 10th on ABC, and Biden's going to be apparently leading, or Klain is going to be leading prep for Biden for that yet again. Biden's inner circle argues that one bad night of a scratchy voice and a few mangled answers doesn't warrant ending at all, and that's quite a way to phrase it. So they've been unleashing the full power of the White House and top Democrats to resist loud calls for him to give up the race. You guys don't get to decide, a source close to Biden said. We don't have smoke-filled rooms, is the idea. And again, this idea that, this would be undemocratic. I saw Jen Psaki saying this would take away the chance of Democratic voters who have, really cast their votes throughout this primary. And then it's like, what primary? There was nothing being mentioned. There was no real candidates. There was no real challenge. Like, even the primaries, the kind of uncontested, essentially, primaries that took place were canceled because there was just so much interest, or so lack of interest, and it was essentially going to be clear that Biden was going to be the nominee. Essentially, their strategy going forward is to dismiss the bedwetting, as they call it, the bedwetting brigade is what they call it. The official White House campaign line is as much ado about nothing, that Biden works so hard it drains his young staff. It's like, again, who is supposed to believe this at this point? It's just like, you are telling us that, it's all sunshine and rainbows. It's just like, this is not a realistic thing. But I guess if they're going to keep going for this, they have no other choice. The attitude is driving officials and donors, basically any top Democrat not on the Biden payroll, key point here, nuts. Again, notice that not on the Biden payroll, or not a direct Biden family member, is not buying this for a penny. They feel it is delusional. Nonetheless, Biden allies are cranking out data and pushing out surrogates to assist that he won bad night, mostly because of scratchy voice and over preparation. And it's only over preparation, if you can't remember all the facts that a leader of the free world should be able to remember. There are some results that they're trying to highlight, I guess, and I think it's a fair assessment of the polling that's come out thus far. Although there was a really interesting, kind of really bad New Hampshire poll that had Trump winning by 2 after I think Biden won by 7 in 2020. So that would be a big Trump swing. But essentially the claim from them is, it's essentially unchanged. And they today, in a highly unusual move, released internal polls that showed them losing. But it was the same amount they were losing as before the debate. So essentially it didn't matter. They warned of the chaos of having a potential convention and picking a Democrat even more unpopular than Biden, namely Vice President Kamala Harris, which, by the way, polls are showing that there was a poll out, I think, from Data for Progress that the Biden administration put out that essentially showed that I think Harris had like 2 points better favorability than Biden. They know Biden needs to make it to a Democratic convention in Chicago, which opens 8 weeks from today. After that, unity is the only choice. Biden allies helps orchestrate the supportive tweets by President Clinton and Obama that happened after furious back-channeling by allies. You could tell that was a pretty big moment on Friday. And the truth is that was the easy part. So they got a lot more time to fill here, I guess, to kind of keep people pushing, and then just till they get to the convention, and then they kind of it's all set in stone at that point. The White House knows Chuck Schumer and House Democratic leader Hakeem Jeffries are deeply concerned that an unpopular Biden could cost them seats on Election Day, and that's a big thing to watch for right now. Biden is getting creamed in a lot of states relative to Senate candidates, and then if that starts to change, you can see some real upset within the party. Former Senator Tom Harkin, who served with Biden for 20-plus years in the Senate, said in an email to supporters the debate was a disaster from which Biden cannot recover. Jeffrey Katzenberg and other top backers are working the phones to reassure some of the deep-pocketed donors to the Biden campaign, and he is also trying to prove his vitality, like at that North Carolina rally, and some very limited senses where he could still show out he's strong. Preferably not read from a teleprompter, but preferably keep it within the hours of, again, 10 to 4. Ignore/engage the media. That's another strategy that Axios is saying here. On the one hand, Biden allies want everyone to ignore the prominent columnists who love Biden. And Morning Joe also is another big one, are now calling for his resignation. Other than the campaign and White House, other than that, on the other hand, the campaign and the White House are deeply engaged with reporters like us, they say, Jim and Mike from Axios, writing about presidential fitness. Biden's campaign kitchen cabinet sees a recipe for a narrow victory that includes a grand slam speech at the Democratic convention in Chicago, a strong showing in the next debate, plus positive economic news in the fall, including a possible Fed rate cut. Biden's camp is betting that they believe voters will give more weight to Biden's judgment as record than his grandpa gate or fading debate dexterity. It's one of the greatest gambles in the history of politics. I think it's pretty fair to say. Once again, Biden's team is telling Democratic voters, you just have to believe. This kind of, this classic Biden, watch me, as he used to say when people would ask him about his age. That is no longer functional, and, he really seems to be facing a lot of continued calls, some of the anger and deep within the Democratic Party, and I think the fact that you, Justin, are saying what you're saying, as someone who has been a pretty big Democratic supporter, is pretty telling. I apologize, I kind of went on a little bit of a tangent there going through that article, but I do want to get your reaction to that. You're really seeming to be some pretty high discontent from pretty much everyone who doesn't directly stand to benefit from Biden getting another term.
Yeah, and I think you've raised lots of interesting points. Obviously, that article is, the Biden campaign might view it as something that's, a strategy. Those of us with eyes and ears might view it as deeply troubling. And I think that there's just there's too much dissonance right now between the Biden campaign and where Democratic voters are at. Because as you were saying, the vast majority of Democratic voters think it should be someone other than Biden. Now, at this point, obviously, we mentioned what someone like Jen Psaki had said, where if we end up going with another nominee, then it robs the Democratic base of their vote. But as you mentioned, obviously the primary wasn't, to call it a primary is a bit of an overstatement. But also, the history that Democratic voters have is, at least stemming back to 2020 and definitely now, is this notion that we just have to pick between the lesser of the two evils. And so even though we know it should be someone other than Joe Biden, or at least some people know that, or some people view that rather, or believe that, that we'll still come around and we'll still make the right decision in the end and go with Biden. So I think that symbolizes some of the frustration. I'll also note that someone, as you were mentioning, folks who aren't on the Biden payroll or directly members of the Biden family are having different views about whether Biden should continue in the race. One of those people who we just found out, I'm not sure if it came out today or earlier or over the weekend, Gretchen Whitmer, who's been floated as a potential Biden replacement. There was news saying that there was a report rather that she had said, privately to some aides, that she doesn't think that Michigan, a state that Whitmer has started to turn into a blue haven, she doesn't think Michigan is winnable anymore for Joe Biden, and that has to be really concerning.
Yeah, that was a very controversial report because I saw that report, and then right after, she's out to she's disavowing the draft Gretsch kind of comments apparently, and she kind of disavowed that. I think that report was in Politico, but then she kind of came out and said that anyone who says we can't win Michigan, not Biden can't win Michigan, is full of it. So we're gonna continue to fight hard. So like that also raised a lot of eyebrows, and people are saying then she linked her PAC for federal spending. And it's just like, it's like that is definitely a sign that people, the pressure is going to be on, and it's like, it's going to continue because, like, it is just some real, pretty, serious discontent. And I personally think, probably even Kamala Harris, like a lot of people kind of rag on her a lot, but I think just her, that would definitely be the least chaotic way to put up a candidate who, at least relative to Biden, is much more, I think, in touch with the base, much more, obviously much more of a cogent speaker. That's not much of a high bar, kind of a better, communicator, someone who's going to put forward, a much better kind of outlook for this. Do you think, what do you think about, the Kamala whisperings, some of the Gretchen Whitmer whisperings, and the possible just timetable for this to play out, because it really could keep going. At this will he, won't he? What's going to be the future here until the convention?
Yeah, and so I think that the benefit for the Democratic Party of having the debates early, at least having the debates now, is to give, and I think it was designed this way, frankly, but is to give the Democrats time post debate to reassess. And I think that's what we must do right now. And to see back to Whitmer, or to Whitmer rather, I think that her comments, and as you were mentioning, the we can win this and our policies are good, and that sort of non-committal language that Democrats are using is emblematic of a kind of half measure strategy that Democrats are taking. And that half measure strategy is really concerning, because I think at a certain point, at least probably within the next month and a half, Democrats are going to have to make a decision as to whether if they're fully committing and fully running with Biden, or if they're switching someone else. Because what can't happen is Democrats, or on one hand, what can't happen is Democrats are sort of wishy-washy now. Oh, we're not sure that we can stand with him. And then in a month and a half say, actually, no, we're cool. We're fine with him. Because that projects weakness, and that projects settling. But at the same time, Democrats, if Democrats wait the sort of month and a half, and end up picking someone else, maybe that's too long, and maybe that's too long for them to really get their, to hit the ground running. And so I think that, this reassessment period that's happening after the debate is going to be really important, at least in the next 2 weeks, 3 weeks. And as far as the Kamala Harris rumors are going, again, her favorability, I've seen some of those polls. I think that the fact that she's more favorable than Joe Biden says more about Joe Biden than I think it does about her, because we know obviously she's been a deeply unpopular politician for a long time, whether it stems from early on in her career with marijuana related prosecutions that during her time as AG of California, or whether that extends to potentially but even potentially sexist tropes about her and how she conducts herself and how she talks. Whatever those reasoning, or whatever that reasoning might be, her favorability still isn't high, and so to see Harris's approval ratings or favorability as higher than those of Joe Biden, I don't know if that's good for her as much as it is bad for Biden. Now, I do think that she projects more confidence and more strength, and at least stronger vitality than Joe Biden does. But I would prefer, at least as a Democratic voter, I would prefer that we went with a different candidate. But again, I'm not seeing a very deep bench of candidates here. I think that for all of them except Whitmer, oddly enough, I can think of a reason within 5 or 10 seconds as to why they couldn't do it. And so just to run through the list really quickly, or at least some of it, with Gavin Newsom, he's been floated as an option. He conducts himself well. He's a charming politician, but he also during the COVID-19 pandemic, he conducted himself with a little bit of hypocrisy. Obviously, was hosting or attending sort of social gatherings during a time when he was sort of prohibiting those events. Someone like Pete Buttigieg is I think he's a clear speaker and articulate. As Secretary of Transportation, the infrastructure of this country isn't doing very well right now. I don't think he's responsible for the derailment in East Palestine, Ohio. I don't think he's responsible for Amtrak's failings, for flight cancellations, for any of that. I don't think that's his that's his prerogative, just as much as gas prices aren't directly Biden's fault, for example. But at the same time, seeing his or seeing what the outlook of transportation and infrastructure has looked like under a Buttigieg or under Pete's leadership, I think that is potentially concerning. My personal choice in terms of who I think checks all of the boxes in terms of policy, but also in terms of how he speaks and how he comforts people with his language would be Hakeem Jeffries. But as we know, Jeffries is really angling for that Speaker of the House job. That's what he's been preparing for, and I think that's what he really wants. On top of the fact that as a staunch Biden ally, to put yourself forward as to put yourself forward as an option, especially now during this period where we might still elect to go with Joe Biden, or we might choose someone else, is obviously a bit of a dangerous gambit. And so I think that Democrats would be wise to start having these conversations now, and to really avoid the half measure strategy that I had outlined. But at the same time, the bench of folks who would be ready, willing, and able to take up the job, or to take up not even the job, but to take up the mantle of running for the job, is getting slimmer by the day, I think.
Yeah, the Hakeem Jeffries name there definitely surprised me. That is interesting, but I do want to get to this window that you're talking about, and all it does kind of depend what if Biden has just the microscope for every time he comes in, appears in public, is going to be on him really intensely right now, and we are seeing that very, very closely. And apparently this has been happening. A lot of these concerns have been growing for quite a period of time. Here is Carl Bernstein of Woodward and Bernstein fame, obviously the Washington Post reporter who broke Watergate, talking about some of the incidents that he's heard about that have been less publicized, although anyone who's been paying attention has seen some really bad Biden moments over the last 4 years.
Journalist. So, Carl, according to the people you've been talking to, what are you hearing?
Well, these are people, several of them, who are very close to President Biden, who love him, have supported him, have been among them are some people who have raised a lot of money for him. And they are adamant that what we saw the other night, the Joe Biden we saw, is not a one-off, that there have been 15, 20 occasions in the last year and a half when the president has appeared somewhat as he did in that horror show that we witnessed. And what's so significant is the people that this is coming from, and also how many people around the president are aware of such incidents, including some reporters, incidentally, who have witnessed some of them. But here we see tonight, as these people say, President Biden at his absolute best, and yet these people who have supported him, loved him, campaigned for him, see him often, say that in the last 6 months particularly, there has been a marked incidence of cognitive decline and physical infirmity.
What I wonder about is the people who were, working with him at Camp David, allegedly in this intensive debate prep, if there were...
Yeah, so that's just a kind of a really interesting kind of inkling there from Bernstein, who is essentially saying a lot of people have been aware about this for a pretty long time, and I think this comes through as we're seeing a DNC call from Jamie Harris, who's the head of the DNC, and Julie Chavez Rodriguez, who's the campaign manager for Biden, essentially saying, get out there, everything's going to be okay. And it pissed people off. This is the people who are the biggest influential members of the party, raising a lot of money, all that. They describe like they are feeling gaslighted. They're asked to ignore the dire nature of the party's predicament. The call, they said, may have worsened a widespread sense of panic among elected officials, donors, and stakeholders. One guy who's a DNC member from Colorado, Joe Salazar, said, I was hoping for more of a substantive conversation instead of, hey, let's go out there and just be cheerleaders, without actually addressing a very serious issue that unfolded in American television for millions of people to see. He said, essentially, we're being pretty gaslit. We don't have any clear plan. DNC rank-and-file members, party strategists, donors are saying they want the 81-year-old Biden to step aside and select a younger replacement of the DNC in August. Biden's closest allies insist that he remains well-positioned, though, obviously, to compete. There was also another call that took place today, a Zoom audio call with about 500 members of the campaign's National Finance Committee and some other contributors. Some of the Biden campaign's most senior officials, including Jenna Malley-Dillon, Deputy Campaign Manager Quentin Folks, and the pollster Molly Murphy, presided for an hour. Chris Corgi, the finance chair of the DNC said everyone just needs to breathe through their nose for a minute, which is like, I'm sure is exactly what you want to hear if you're a Democratic person at the moment. The remarks apparently did little to stem the anxiety of the campaign's well-heeled patrons, according to people on the call who described it while it was ongoing, which is pretty remarkable. Rufus Gifford, a finance chair for Biden, said the fundraising numbers in June would be extremely strong. No live questions from donors. Instead, contributors submitted queries through the Zoom messaging app, but other attendees could not read them, according to people on the call. The campaign then chose pre-submitted inquiries. The campaign manager did not join the call. Some of those in attendance just said it felt facile and rudimentary. And really seemed to be a pretty, to essentially say, this is all being blown out of proportion. This is no big deal. And of course, it's going to be interesting to track the polls here. But the thing that we keep seeing through all these different pieces here, and especially as they try and really speed up the convention for mid-July, which I think would be really seen as a move of just complete desperation, is that they know that he has been this way for a long time. He's unreliable, not able to function well. There was another big Wall Street Journal piece now about how really bad he was at the G7 summit, and he had to essentially skip a meeting with the other 6 G7 leaders where they essentially, it's just the leaders. They talk shop. Probably a lot of important stuff gets discussed there. And he just couldn't do it because it was too late in the day, essentially, was what the Wall Street Journal reported, among other details of his pretty poor performance there. Like, they know he's been this bad, and they, from the way I see it, are making a pretty self-interested play that they don't want to give give up their grasp on power, which when it comes to, Donald Trump staring down the barrel, possible, big gains in the House and Senate, working with a Supreme Court that he appointed to do, God knows what to democracy, and all these people who are, they purport to be very, very scared about it. It really seems to be a pretty despicable thing to continue to do and to continue to push him when they've known that he's been this way. Now, everyone kind of knows how bad he is, and it's been shown right in front of our faces. But still, they seem to be, really just down to the people who, again, directly stand to benefit from her position or his position. Those are the ones that I think are, still continuing to push this. What do you make of this? From what my perspective is just some real selfishness in the face of some pretty serious threats to the country.
Yeah, and I think that, as a Biden Democrat and as someone who's, been on Team Biden for the longest time, hearing, obviously hearing what Bernstein has to say is really concerning, but also hearing the sort of Democratic, fall in line response to that. Not only does it feel sort of unwise and, the opposite of what we're seeing, but it almost feels like an insult to my intelligence. I really do feel that, moving forward with Biden, and again, hearing what, Bernstein has said, how this isn't just a Thursday night problem, but, has been a years-long problem at this point. I believe one of the incidents Bernstein referred to happened in 2020, which was before the election of 2020. I believe it was like June. But I think that there's again, it's emblematic of Biden's potential problems on that front. But I also think that as we sort of as we think about how to move forward, and as we think about how or as we think about Biden's future in this race. I saw this tweet the other day that I'll remember, and it said, are we really about to give up our freedoms and our children's freedoms just because one prideful man doesn't want to get out of the race? And I thought that was interesting, and I took a step back and looked at it because I said, that to me it's extreme, but at the same time, when so much is at stake this election, obviously in light of today's Supreme Court ruling, but also in light of plenty of the other things that Donald Trump said he wanted to do, and that things that have been going on with Project 2025, yep, and that idea of of Republicans and conservative think tanks. I think that what's on top of the fact of the messed up world that we live in, and with issues in the Middle East, with issues in China and Taiwan potentially, obviously the ongoing situation in Russia and Ukraine. I think that to pretend as if we've got a strong, capable leader in the White House right now, who's got nothing wrong with him. That to me is total gaslighting, and I think that and even frankly to indict my own side of the political aisle, as I try to do as much as I can. I think that The New York Times about a week before the debate was saying, they had this article, I believe it was published like June 21st or something, so about a week before the debate. They had an article saying, concerns over Biden's age are largely overstated, and he's as intelligent and as sharp as ever. And again, watching what we saw, and it really does feel like gaslighting in the highest sense. And I understand, because I understand why, it's in the interest of people who support democracy and don't want Trump to be president again, to prop up Biden as much as we can, and to push him up and say, hey, it's okay, one bad debate performance isn't going to be the end of the world, and actually maybe it wasn't so bad, maybe it was a great performance. I think Jill Biden on stage following the debate, or on some kind of campaign rally stage, she said, Joe, you answered every question, you did a great job, and Joe's just standing there, and again, like, and to a cheering crowd as well, and I think that. That's that. Like, I mean, yeah, I'm sure you've got something to say about that, but at least for me, like that to me was just the ultimate insult, to our intelligence as Democratic voters. I've been clear in throughout our conversation that I think we should move forward with someone else. But that to me, at least in terms of what's at stake, I'm not sure I would use. I'm not sure I would say it's selfish, for Biden to stay in the race, but I certainly think, I certainly think that it doesn't have the best interest of the Democratic Party or the Democratic Democratic Party, Democratic voters, or or Americans when if and when he decides to stay in the race, especially after what we saw.
Yeah, I mean, who knows if I think for Biden it's kind of more of like a mixture. It's like pride, spite, whatever. But I do think it's like like they're not going to get to me now. Like I've come this far, kind of a thing. But I do think for a lot of people, it's like they want to. I think there is a certain, just natural inclination. It's like, I don't want to give my spot here in the Oval Office. Got the, executive West Wing here. Like, it's a pretty good gig. Hunter Biden, all the things that he's benefited from being, the son of a president. And I feel like this is definitely something that, Jill, there's a really interesting article about how, Jill Biden, like, kind of really loves riding around in the motorcades. But I feel like that has been a bit, it has been a big sea change over the past, since Thursday, to see a lot of people, because there has been this kind of instinct on the Democratic Party side to always blame the voters, always push the voters to kind of fall in line more, ignore this, ignore that. And you can tell kind of Biden is still trying to do it, think about how worse it would be under Trump. But I feel like there's a lot of people now who really continue, probably would have been making the argument on the other side maybe 2 weeks ago, that are now saying, no, this is not, this is too far. It's on Biden now to realize that he has these limitations and he is hurting us as the voters by putting up a choice where it's Trump and then alternative to somebody who is, really, I think could be pretty easily beaten by a lot of people in the Democratic Party, is going to be, an 81-year-old guy who is just, putting out performances like that on, the regular and a lot of times isn't able to, come out, do these speeches, do these, town halls, tough interviews, like long-term press conferences, all that stuff. So yeah, it is a really, I think, remarkable sea change. It's going to be interesting to see if Biden, who does have the pole position as somebody who has all the power, he's the president, leader of the Democratic Party, and all that, to play off this kind of I think kind of inherent fear that the Democrats have of doing something big and drastic, too close to an election to try and keep his and his associates' position in the Democratic Party intact. So it's definitely going to be interesting to follow that. We do have to move on for the moment, and we will be going to talking about Israel and some interesting stuff coming out of Israel at the moment. Netanyahu, Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, said yesterday during the weekly Israeli government meeting that Israel would continue to fight until achieving our goals, destroying Hamas, returning our hostages, and ensuring that Gaza will no longer be a danger, and returning residents to the north. That's something that we have seen pretty recently being added into, used to be the first part of that. This talk about the north has definitely increased. Israel also has added that has not changed its position on the prisoner exchange proposal put forward by U.S. President Biden earlier in June, adding that it was Hamas who refused the deal, which I think, we can see that they have, referred to it positively. And as we talked about here on the show, their big thing, and I think this is really the thing that is holding it up, is this transition from the phase one of the deal to phase two, and if the ceasefire is able to continue while negotiations in good faith, continue here. We also saw that kind of concurrent to that, Yoav Gallant, Israel's Minister of Defense, said that his government is very close to a decision on changing the security situation in the north by diplomatic or military means. So we see really, with Gaza essentially in a pile of rubble at this point, and very few, targets to, at least to target at this point. They've done all the hospitals essentially. They are now turning towards Lebanon and really looking at an opportunity to push Hezbollah, which is definitely probably their most formidable threat in the near region, kind of backed by Iran, behind the shadows, to essentially go after Hezbollah with what is very likely to, almost certainly going to be the full backing and support of the United States. So yeah, again, Gallant saying very close to making a decision on changing the security situation in the north by diplomatic military means. So I just want to ask, what do you make of the situation? How do you feel? How likely do you feel that a war with Lebanon, or Israel and Lebanon, could be, and what would that look like? What are some of the consequences there?
Sure. So I guess, I am deeply concerned about the prospect of war between Israel and Lebanon. I think that, obviously there's been plenty of past precedent between fighting between Israel and Hezbollah. I think that there's the charged attitudes of what or rather the charged nature of the attitudes of leadership of both both parties to the conflict are definitely reason for concern. Obviously, we had we have the comments that you were referencing, whether it be from Netanyahu or from Minister Gallant. But then you also have the leader of Hezbollah who was saying, he'd be happy to strike Israel, but then also being he made this sort of one-off comment, sort of throwing Cyprus under the bus a little bit recently. And I'm not sure that is that's what pushes the region into sort of into a broader conflict, whether it's the Cyprus comment, but that one particular comment that he made was obviously obviously reason for concern. And then the Cyprian leadership was sort of saying like, well, we're not involved in this. I don't want to get here involved just because we're close in and around the Mediterranean area. But yeah, I am obviously worried. I think that with all that's been happening, particularly in Gaza, and with Israel's forceful military response, it's easy to sort of envision a war in Lebanon with the civilian population there, and what that might end up looking like. Israel's military operation, if they were to go on and engage in it, would in all likelihood, at least at the beginning, be focused on the south, sort of in the area of the Litani River, where Hezbollah, according to UN resolutions, has been ordered to move north of it. They hadn't really there's been a lot of disagreement, or rather not, following that particular resolution. But I think that, the evacuation of like most of Israel's citizens from the northern parts of the country is obviously reason for concern, not just because they no longer live in the homes that they occupy, but also in, it shows that Israel is viewing the war with Lebanon as a serious threat, and as a real potential threat. And so I think, obviously it's deeply concerning. I think that the attitude for war is obviously pretty high right now. And Israel feels like the bear that you don't want to poke, or else something bad will happen. And I don't think that is I don't think that that's fantastic logic from the Israeli side as to whether just to say, don't tempt us or else we'll go after you, because obviously it seems as if, even though Israel is militarily seeming to be winning the Gaza war right now, it's certainly losing the sort of public relations war at this point, and the media in the media sense. And I think that for Israel's long-term security, they really do have to balance some competing interests here, because they do have to balance the potentially untenable threat of danger from the north with an army like that Hezbollah has, which is by all accounts much stronger, much more well equipped than that of Hamas. But also, what actually going into Lebanon might do, for Israel's perception in the world, but also what it might do for how Israel's allies end up treating it. And I think that those are considerations that Prime Minister Netanyahu is going to have to make, or if new elections are called, as rumors after Gantz departed the unity government, if those new elections are called potentially, what those folks look like, and what those folks look for rather in a in Israel Lebanon, not relations, but in that conflict. And so there are definitely competing interests. Obviously, it's great reason for concern. And yeah, I think that there's, it's definitely a worrying situation right now. And I'm not, yeah, you'd ask me to predict what the sort of consequences might be. I think that the consequences could be really, really dire, whether it be for, for folks in Lebanon, whether it be for, potentially the army that Hezbollah's got, but also for Israel's resources, and to have them fighting a war on a second front at this point, would seem, untenable for, for Israel itself. And obviously there's been questions of whether they have to call up the Haredim in Israel itself, and the ultra-Orthodox Jewish folks who had historically been exempt from IDF service, mandatory service, but also in the type of warfare, right? If you're spread thin, potentially the type of warfare you use gets sort of more distant. You might see more drones, and obviously that results in higher civilian death tolls, and so it could really get ugly, and I'm really concerned about it.
Yeah. I've seen some reports in German intelligence saying this could come in the third or fourth week, maybe, of July. That's why they got Lufthansa to cancel all the flights into Lebanon. But yeah, if I'm looking at this from, and we talked about this in the last show because I wrote a bit of a article about it, but if I'm looking at this from Israel and especially Netanyahu's perspective, it's like we need Netanyahu would have a big incentive of wanting this war to continue, wanting to continue to put Israel in this heightened state of attack or being under attack, and fighting out against its enemies to try and stave off that inevitable call for an election. Well, he has improved to some degree in the polls. It has not been enough with his coalition to get over the line of Gantz coalition, possibly. I think it's like the National Unity Coalition is what it would be called. So he and then Israel, I think is a very good point in what you said about their resources have been already kind of stretched thin, and it has been I think it's fair to say not as much of a cakewalk as Israel would have liked on the ground, specifically in Gaza. And if they were to go against Hezbollah, which is about 10 times more equipped, more resourced than Hamas is, and also happen to be benefited by not be fully cut off by a siege from the Israeli side over the course of 16 years, or however long it's been since 2006. It was 18 at this point. Forgive my math there, but I think if they, as we've seen in reports that Biden has promised pretty much full and complete support for Israel when they go into Hezbollah, I think it presents a very good opportunity and possibly a pretty big boon to Netanyahu if they're able to come in with Israel and strongly U.S.-backed firepower to take on one of their most hated, most dangerous enemies in the region, and then possibly kind of have the ability to go full tilt even more when Trump comes into power, as is looking, as we just talked about for the last 15 minutes, increasingly likely, and then resolve the situation in Gaza in a way that redounds to Israeli benefit, maximalist Israeli benefit, to be precise, and then turn to Hezbollah and essentially wage a war against them, and kind of kneecap their ally, kneecap Iranian influence in a very successful way. And it's going to be interesting to see what type of fight Hezbollah will put up to that, if that does happen. But it seems like here a very good, very dangerous opportunity for the rest of the world, but very good opportunity for Israel to essentially go after one of its most hated enemies with the support of the most powerful military in the history of the world. Do you buy that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a couple things. So I think under normal circumstances, I potentially would, or I would buy it a little bit more. In the sense of, obviously, the United States has made it very clear that they support Israel's right to defend itself and right, security at that point. And I think that the threats from Hezbollah are obviously very concerning. Even Secretary of State Blinken had been talking about this recently, and how he'd been saying that it's obviously a concerning situation up north for Israel. He's famously sort of cautioned. He's cautioned against lots of a military strategy rather for Israel in the past, even though the so-called red lines that the Biden administration has been placing on Israel haven't exactly been followed at this point.
That's
But
one way of
the other
putting it.
thing, well, yeah.
Yeah.
But I think that there's that there's some, the fact that we're in an election year, but that we're approaching an election as well, and how Biden's attitude potentially has shifted. Because I do think that in his sort of heart of hearts, he is very pro-Israel, and obviously in his actions he has been as well. But even his attitude and shifting, and his shifting attitude and how he talks to members of his party or other folks, where he starts to speak about, instead of how do we aid Israel in any way that we can, even though he's doing that, and even though the Congress has just sort of passed an aid package. I also think that he's at least been fielding questions and concerns about how do we restrain Israel, and so I think that as with reference to Lebanon, with reference to whether I buy the idea that Israel could go into Lebanon with the full support of the U.S. I think if Israel made the case, to the United States that it was critical that that particular Hezbollah infrastructure be destroyed for Israel's national security, I'm certain the U.S. would back it. Now, again, I also don't think that that's sort of necessary prerequisite for U.S. backing, because I think U.S. backing might be potentially maybe vocally critical of Israel, or at least somewhat critical of Israel vocally, if they were to do that, at least not after they actually engage in a military operation, as we've seen, but saying like, oh yeah, we support Israel's right to defend itself, we support its military operations, but we'd like to see them avoid civilian casualties when we can. That's sort of been the language that the Biden administration has been using, and I think that, as we know, again with reference to Lebanon, I think that there's no reason why why I'd expect to see any a much different part of the language. Now, again, whether or not Iran decides to get directly involved in this, could change how the U.S. And the U.K. and other Western allies get involved to support Israel. But I do think at least that that the U.S., the U.K., other folks in the West are deeply worried about what regional conflict could look like, because they know that if Israel goes into Lebanon, the odds that conflict stays in Lebanon are diminishing by the minute.
Yeah, so I kind of see where I'm going on that, but I do have a hard time buying it, especially because we've seen in my personal theory on that is that they held off this one weapon shipment, granted on that, but I would definitely say that they have been really, really responsive in terms of and kind of playing out the strategy of offering some lip service to the Democratic base, who's been increasingly disquieted, to say the least, with some of Israel's actions. But they, this is in CNN as of the 21st of June. Senior U.S. officials reassured a delegation of top Israeli officials visiting Washington this week that if a full-blown war were to break out on Israel's northern border between Israel and Hezbollah, the Biden administration is fully prepared to back its ally, according to a senior administration official. So I think fully prepared, full backing. I think that means that there is going to be that there's going to be a pretty robust support. Whether that, I don't think it's going to mean U.S. troops at least right away, but I feel like it's a very, very hard time for me to imagine Israel not getting anything and everything that they want and need to go after Hezbollah, especially with the geopolitical implications. So possibly taking out Iran. So I think it does wear down pretty heavily to Israel's benefit there. And it is just one though of the implications going on at the moment. We also see some prisoner releases, which has been pretty interesting. Israeli forces released 50 Palestinians from the Gaza Strip who had been detained during the current war, including director of the Israeli-destroyed Al-Shifa Hospital, Mohammed Abu Salamia, who was detained by Israeli troops in November. According to testimonies by survivors from Al-Shifa and other released detainees, Dr. Abu Salamia was arrested after he refused to make public claims that Hamas fighters were using Al-Shifa for military purposes. Testimonies of fellow detainees indicated that Abu Salamia was beaten and humiliated during his detention, which is pretty notable. Israelis, no surprise here, but Itamar Ben-Gvir said Abu Salamia's release was a security neglect. Meanwhile, Benny Gantz, the opposition leader, who I think a lot of people would paint as the positive, friendly face of Israel in contrast to Netanyahu, also criticized Abu Salamaya, who, by the way, the release of Dr. Abu Salamaya, again, emphasis on the doctor part there, and other 50 other Palestinians calling it an operational and moral mistake. In response, the Israeli Public Broadcasting Service said the release of the detainees on Monday was because Israeli jails were full. So that that puts into perspective of what's been going on in the prisons. We had some Al Jazeera footage that was broadcast that have obtained Palestinian detainees showing them forced by Israeli soldiers to enter buildings ahead of them with their hands cupped behind their backs, some semi-naked, with hanging cameras, essentially to see if Hamas had booby-trapped the building first, essentially. One detainee is seen forced to enter a tunnel opening and walking deep into the tunnel while tied with a rope and holding a camera. Last week, Israeli media reported a significant decrease in food quantity was given to the Palestinian prisoners. Israeli Security Minister Ben-Gvir commented that it was part of Israel's deterrent strategy. And this is, again, a government that Biden is preparing to, again, fully support, if you believe CNN's MJ Lee, in terms of another incursion into another country. So I think that is certainly very notable. And that comes after reports in 972 magazine where this lawyer was going to work to meet in the kind of really infamous prison, I'm probably not saying this right, of Sidi Tayman, where we have had Palestinians essentially calling it a death camp. So this lawyer goes to meet this Palestinian reporter working for a Saudi Arabian outlet, and he really told some pretty horrific stories going on in there. So they're continuously blindfolded and tied up with their hands tied behind their backs. The detainees forced to sleep hunched over on the floor without any bedding. Their iron handcuffs are removed only for a weekly minute-long shower, but the prisoners began refusing to shower because they don't have watches, and going beyond the allotted minute exposes prisoners to severe punishments, including hours outside in the heat or the rain. All detainees, Mahajane noted, face deteriorating health conditions due to the poor quality of the daily prison diet, a small amount of lebane, which is some bread and a piece of cucumber or tomato. They also suffer from severe constipation, and for every 100 prisoners, there's only one roll of toilet paper provided per day. And something else that probably isn't helping the constipation aspect of it is Arab also testified to, and this is the reporter that the lawyer was going to visit, he testified to his lawyer that Israeli guards sexually assaulted 6 prisoners with a stick in front of other detainees after they had violated prison orders. When he talked about rapes, I asked him, Muhammad, are you a journalist? Are you sure about this? This is the lawyer talking here. But he said he saw it with his own eyes, and that what he was telling me was only a small part of what was happening there. And this was, after, New York Times reports where we have seen, some eyewitness cases of some really horrific rapes, including rapes with electrically vibrating stick or something. That is the one that was in the New York Times. So some really horrific stuff when we've heard about that. This general treatment of doctors, of prisoners, and this just general really rough conditions to say the least. Has been a pretty consistent story in anywhere from more pro-Palestinian outlets like Mondoweiss to Israeli media, leftist Israeli media like 972 magazine, to even places like the New York Times or CNN. So what do you think, Justin, that this says about this country, so Benny Gantz, it's not just this government, this country that the U.S. is trying to support, and their views on Palestinians in general, and the way they're treating them in this war?
Yeah, so obviously it's really troubling. And what you said, what you said just now and what you've laid out is really troubling. I think that two things can be true at the same time, and I want to make it super clear. These reports are deeply troubling. I have no defense of Itamar Ben-Gvir. I think that his comments have largely throughout this war been rather despicable. I think that his strategy of sort of reclaiming Gaza as, part of like greater Israel, or his strategy, I think are not only deeply misguided in a political, in a practical sense, pragmatic sense, but also in a moral sense. I think that he is a deeply flawed person, self-described, fascist. And I think that we would be smart to at least as folks on the pro-Israel side, would be smart to sort of disavow Itamar Ben-Gvir at every turn. Now, at the same time, I'd also push back just a little bit on his direct role in terms of influencing the voice of the Netanyahu government. I think obviously he's part of the he's sort of the Likud majority, even though he's part of Otzma Yehudit. But I think that he's Netanyahu has vocally and outwardly criticized what do you call it? Itamar Ben-Gvir's Gaza plans, Gaza policy, if you will, for the day after, for the future of this war. But again, that doesn't I obviously know that Benny Gantz had similar comments to to what Ben-Gvir said, although definitely less forceful. I think that
an
Gantz
operational and moral mistake is what the
sorry,
comments
can you repeat that?
From Benny Gantz, he called the release of the Dr. Abu Salameh and 50 other Palestinians an operational and moral mistake. So again, not just on the the strategy of it, but it was just wrong to release these people, according to the Israeli public broadcaster, because the jails were full, in his opinion.
Sure, and I think that again, I don't have I would need to look into that situation just a little bit more. I'm not going to blindly take Benny Gantz's word for it. I will say, however, though, that past prisoner releases from the Israeli side, Yahya Sinwar was famously a released prisoner back in, I believe, 2014, in exchange for an IDF soldier. And I think and the worry among some measure or some portions of the Israeli public is that released Palestinian prisoners sort of pose the same risk. I'm not personally of that particular view. Because I think different people are different. As I try to hold the standard of, again, two bad things can be bad at the same time. And so, you could have, it could have been, for example, I will freely defend the fact that it was a operational and moral mistake to free Yahya Sinwar at that moment. However, I won't, I'm not willing to make that comment about the doctor that you had just mentioned. And I am deeply troubled by the comments, and obviously comments, as you had talked about, of reported sexual assaults. That to me is deeply troubling. And I think that, as you had mentioned that it had been in some newspapers in the New York Times. I will also add that there had been reports of the New York Times, of us. And again, I'm not here trying to equivocate it at this point, or trying to pretend that one idea is better, or not idea, one side of the conflict is better or more justified than another in terms of its sexual assaults. But I have seen the New York Times reports about the reported sexual assaults of Israeli women. I've seen those doubted in the past, and so just because it's in the Times, it doesn't make it gospel. At the same time, I'm not here to doubt anyone's sexual assault experience, just as I would expect. I would expect, and I encourage folks to believe Israeli women. I would obviously encourage folks not to discount the really horrific, it seems, experiences of Palestinian prisoners. And I think that the treatment of detainees is a really important standard to uphold in war at this point, or at all points rather. And I think that there's the reports that we've seen. I'm going to choose to believe them at this point, even though I need to I definitely need to look into it a lot more. But I'm going to choose to believe them. And I think that there's, again, really, really deeply troubling stuff. But to bring it back to what you would wanted this question to be, in terms of if I what my thoughts are on the United States supporting a country that does these things. I would say that two things can be true at the same time, which is that these things can be utterly despicable, and that also that the U.S. has an interest in maintaining Israel's security, and that the U.S. has an interest in terms of what the U.S. Wants to do here. It seems to me that that the Biden policy, but also even if Trump wins, his policy in supporting Israel is generally in American foreign policy interests here. I think that as the U.S. views Iran as an increasingly or as an increasing threat and as a growing threat, I think that winding up on the same side as it, or rather not taking the entirely opposite side, rather is what I sort of meant to say, would be a bad or a poor strategy for the U.S. if it wanted to maintain its position of being sort of anti-Iran at this particular point. I'll also add that I think here's where we see potentially a double standard being foisted on Israel a little bit, and I think that there are times when we can point to horrifying reports, even war crimes that that countries have committed, but the simple fact that those exist doesn't mean that we should stop or that we should stop supporting the existence of a country or the ability of that country to defend itself. There are other examples. There are other examples in history where you might see, just to name one, the interning of Japanese Americans, for example, in World War II. That was done by the United States. Other countries could have looked at that and said, "Wow, this is deeply horrifying." As Americans should have been more horrified than they were. It was legal up until a couple of years ago, actually. Or the internment case Korematsu v. U.S. wasn't actually overturned until like 2018 in the Trump versus Y decision. I'm not saying that there would have been a second period of internment camps, but that just shows that the U.S. is definitely still making progress on it, and we're still early on in the progress of correcting our past mistakes. But at the same time, that wouldn't the practice of internment camps wouldn't have or rather shouldn't have meant that our allies in World War II should have stopped supporting us. And so I think that, again, like I said, two things can be true at the same time. It can be utterly horrifying what we're seeing out of Gaza and what those reports that you specifically mentioned just now. And at the same time, I think it can still be in the greater prevailing American interest to end up supporting Israel. Now, I'm also not in favor of sort of complete blind support, such that it would amount to the approving, sanctioning, supporting of these horrifying war crimes that we're hearing about. But at the same time, I think it's it's potentially not we're doing our critical thinking a bit of a disservice if we don't still say, well, okay, what else about the war is there something else about the war that's in the U.S. interest for Israel to prevail? And so I think that potentially earmarking certain funds or potentially saying, oh, not withholding certain offensive weaponry, or whether it's increasing sanctions on settlers who commit who commit acts of violence. I think that those can be sort of positive steps in how the U.S. sort of directs its policy while maintaining Israel's security as a priority, but also sanctioning the activities of violent settlers or of members of the IDF themselves. And I think that we can see a bit of dissonance between the policies of Joe Biden and Benjamin Netanyahu right now. Netanyahu released that video to social media, I want to say 2 weeks ago at this point. I could be wrong, but saying how it was preposterous that the U.S. would be withholding weapons from Israel, and even Israel's biggest defenders in the United States, Richie Torres, John Fetterman, these people, and Fetterman, who met with Netanyahu a few days ago, even these guys were saying on Twitter, how about you keep your policy disagreements sort of private here? Let's not, don't tell us that we're not helping you when we are, but we're just concerned that we support Joe Biden's policy in terms of withholding certain weaponry. And so I think that, again, this situation, and all situations and more, but particularly this one, requires an especially critical lens that we have to look at. And again, I want to be super, super clear. It does not excuse any of the rhetoric of Israel's particularly far right, politicians, but not always far right, because obviously Gantz isn't a super far right politician. It doesn't excuse the behavior of members of the IDF, and it certainly doesn't excuse the continued prosecution of the war in the way that it's being fought. And at the same time, I think it can still be in the prevailing U.S. interest to support Israel in its war in its potential, hopefully not, but in its potential war with Lebanon. I apologize if that was a bit of a winding answer, but I'm happy to revisit elements if you need.
Oh yeah, you're totally good. Just let it. And to go back to what you said, before about like the prisoner exchange and with Yahya Sinwar. To be clear, this one was just a kind of unilateral Israeli release. There was no kind of exchange with Hamas or in release for any hostages, which both sides have obviously said they are pretty keen on doing. But I do find it very interesting about like your defense, and you're kind of looking into those situations and kind of putting those on the the same moral level as some what Israel is doing is putting it on some of the same moral level as some of the worst moments that we've seen in American history. And I like with regards to the internment camps and with all that, and I do think it is definitely especially very notable to see with the Benny Gantz situation and both sides kind of coming out very strongly against this, and especially with your talking about the U.S. interest, and I think a lot of even some of the the more liberal Zionist side of which I think would it be fair to characterize you as a pretty liberal Zionist?
Yeah. Yes.
And have kind of made this this moral case a lot of times throughout the war about defending Israel would be kind of a moral thing to do. But I heard you there kind of say, and correct me if I'm wrong, that it's much more of a kind of strategic thing for the U.S. to come in and be on defense of Israel, not in terms of how it positions itself with regards to Iran and kind of exercising its influence in the Middle East, fighting for what it wants to see in the Middle East as kind of a really kind of realist kind of geopolitical strategy, not necessarily a moral undertaking at this point. Which some things I found to be pretty interesting in your response. I'm sure you and really anyone. Listeners to my show would be pretty well aware of where I stand on that. But yeah, if you have any I just hit the UK elections just shortly here. But if there's any last words you want to say, I want to give you this chance to say them.
Sure. Yeah, and I think your assessment of my view is largely correct. I mean, I was mostly referring to in terms of how we direct foreign policy. I think that as much as I would like foreign policy to be directed a lot towards or more towards morality than it currently is, I was sort of thinking more along the lines of the fact that foreign policy is obviously and it's sort of manifestly very interest driven, and so I think that the U.S. has a strong interest in maintaining Israel's security. I would also say that morally, I think there's an interest in there's a couple moral interests at play, and I think that the U.S. has a complicated role here. I'll keep it super brief, but I think that there is a moral. I think that there is a moral interest in defeating Hamas, but at the same time, I also think that there is a moral interest in limiting civilian casualties. And so I wouldn't say, that the U.S. should give Israel the sort of green light to just do whatever is necessary. I don't think that, as much as maybe on October 8th, I might have supported, Netanyahu's destroy Hamas, idea of how he wanted to prosecute the war. Now that we are, almost 9 months in at this point, I think that, and you mentioned earlier in our conversation how we, Israel might have definitely had thought it would have been more of a cakewalk at this point, or than it actually has been. I certainly think that the justifications for continuing, I think that there's justifications from a practical and from an interest-driven sense in continuing continuing support for Israel. I also think that there is moral justification in the sense of the fact that there's American hostages still being held, but also from a U.S. perspective, but also the fact that I think that that defeating Hamas is a moral issue. At the same time, I would be blind to see to not notice the deeply troubling scenes that we see out of Gaza. It truly is heartbreaking to see every time you open your phone. Whether it's a starving child, whether it's a child. I think there was a study that came out that said Gaza has one of the highest, if not the highest, percentages of children with amputations. I believe that was a study that came out. Again, as a human, it's hard to see that and not just feel absolutely heartbroken at this point. And I tend to think that this at least the scale of this war wouldn't have happened had October 7th not happened. But at the same time, I also know that there's been a complicated history and that it's not as if no Palestinians would have died if October 7th didn't happen. And I'm also not blind enough to realize that, or blind enough to neglect, rather, that, October 7th, it didn't just happen in a vacuum. There were things that happened before it that, led Hamas to commit these atrocities that they did. Mm-hmm. And so I think that there's certainly complex morals, but yeah, long story short, I think that there is a foreign policy interest in continuing support for Israel and Israel's security. I think that there's a moral interest in terms of specifically getting the American hostages back, but also, upholding, morale in Israel. And at the same time, there must be, a greater effort in terms of getting aid into Gaza. I think that the pier was initially a good idea. Obviously, that has sort of, fallen apart literally and figuratively. And I think that there's, it would be in not just the Biden administration's best interest, but in our moral sort of best interest to do as much as we can to get increasing amounts of aid into Gaza. But I'm happy to move on to the UK.
Yeah. It is definitely very interesting, and I think the point you raised about the American hostages specifically is very interesting as well. And there has been a thing about recently about Biden potentially discussing with Hamas going through Qatari interlocutors to try and get those U.S. hostages out. I do believe, from my end, that's something you can do without, aiding some of the stuff that we're seeing that we just talked about. But yeah, I do think from the kind of hardcore, religious Zionists, Ben Gvir's side, we've seen a lot more honest. Like, this is about expanding the power of Israel on the world stage, where we're standing up for ourselves, or quote unquote, defeating Hamas. And that is something that they've been pretty honest about. But I do think it's interesting, and I think more to see the kind of honesty coming more now from yourself and kind of the more liberal Zionist camp about what is going on. And although I do definitely take your points on the the moral side there, so to switch gears a little bit, we are seeing the UK election is coming up on July 4th, trying to get us U.S. followers of American politics to really not watch it. I guess they don't want us to see how bad Rishi Sunak goes down. But really interesting stuff. Just to give you kind of a catching up, a very brief catching up of what's been going on for because we have not talked about it at all here on the show. There has been, conservatives called this election kind of end of May. Rishi Sunak called this election end of May, essentially probably from the aspect of, it can only get worse than it is now. And it has been a pretty rough campaign for them. It's been, gaffe after gaffe. One notable one was, leaving D-Day commemoration early to go, pretty much the last time that, all the D-Day participants would still be alive. And, in the same place, he goes back to, film a TV interview. This is kind of coincided as we have seen the hard social, right-wing positions of Nigel Farage and the Reform Party come to prominence around that same time, kind of capturing this anger at Sunak for kind of not being tough enough on immigration, for anti-troop sentiment. And as the Tories' poll ratings have collapsed from 23 to 20 to 19, 18, 17, 16, and Reform have kind of taken on that social conservative energy, again led by the very pro-Brexit Nigel Farage. They have essentially are essentially at level pegging, as the Brits would say, in the polls. Which is really, really remarkable. We've seen a pretty interesting surge from, I wouldn't say a surge, but, an increase in the Green Party vote as kind of more of the, left-wing energy gets dispersed a bit from the Labour Party. But the Labour Party has had a, pretty solid campaign by doing what they've always done and, essentially staying very boring, staying very centrist, saying, pretty much, down the line and just saying, don't you hate these Tories? And a lot of people are like, we really hate them. We want to get them out. Starmer has been, Keir Starmer, leader of the Labour Party and next, Prime Minister of the UK, in all likelihood, on the 5th of July, is standing up for a pretty, I would say a solidly liberal administrations can be very close to the U.S. Not going to do too many big things economically. At least that's what they say. Although that might change, whether they like it or not. And they, kind of are in the driver's seat at the moment as we continue to see, the Conservative Party potentially getting under 100 seats. And to put in perspective, they had about some mid 300s at the last election, so it would be a massive drop off for them. There also have been some pretty interesting independent cases that have been going on, around the country, as Labor has essentially for a lot of times just support for the Palestinian cause. Jeremy Corbyn is there's a lot more going on than just the Palestinian cause for Jeremy Corbyn, but Faiza Shaheen has been one name that has been essentially kicked off of the Labor candidacy and forced to run as an independent for her support. So there has been this kind of disparate, very left-wing energy that has been spread out to some other candidates as well, and it'll be interesting to see if they can get across the line, which is going to be a very tough task for them on July 4th. So that's kind of just a general overview of where the party in Scotland as well. The route for Labour getting majority is a lot of times through Scotland, and for the last I think it's been 9 years at this point, the Scottish National Party has dominated due to a lot of financial issues and the way they fund their party. Their once all powerful leader Nicola Sturgeon was in a lot of trouble for how she managed those funds. Scottish National Party pretty much controlled all of Scotland's seats at the last election, and they're looking to lose, at best case, about a third of those, and hand Labour a bunch of their old seats in Scotland back, which is going to be a critical road for them to getting the majority. This is going to be, just to give you your just kind of general thoughts and what you're looking at, Justin, going into this election to wrap it up here on July 4th coming up.
Yeah, and so it's been, nothing short of a catastrophe for the Tories. I think that they've, from sort of start to finish, obviously Rishi Sunak's announcement coming, in the rain, being, emblematic of potentially his, of his failures to run a government that makes any sense. Just to see the spectacle of that was, definitely troublesome for the Tories. I will also say that the betting scandal that just sort of dropped the idea of his of members of his party, placing bets on the date of the election. I'm not saying or suggesting that Sunak knew about that beforehand and that he, sort of told them like, hey, you should do this. But at the same time, as the leader of the party, you ought to have a responsibility to know what's going on within your party. He certainly knows who he told about the election on, that was going to come up on July 4th. And so obviously to see people in his party bet on election day is really concerning. He has since suspended those two candidates. But it took a little bit of pressure. There were some town halls that he gave where
way too much time.
Yeah, and there were some town halls that he gave where he was sort of non-committal at first because he was waiting for pending results of the Gambling Commission. And frankly, I don't even think those results have fully come out yet. I could be wrong, so I don't want to commit to that fully. But it just took him, I don't think he waited for even internal investigation results. At a certain point, he realized the public pressure was too high, and so he had to drop those candidates. And again, that's sort of emblematic of Rishi Sunak and the Conservative Party's government and governing style in the UK, which is, lots of too little, too late. And he talks about his bold plan or his bold actions, and his actions are certainly bold sometimes. With potentially with the national service idea. For those of your listeners who might not know what that is, his idea that 18-year-olds in the UK will either have to join the military for a year or elect a different option, which is service, community service, essentially 1 weekend a month. Where they could be helping out at senior homes, and that idea, or that's just one idea of what he might do. But then again, that idea, while I applaud the patriotism, I guess he speaks of it as his bold action, but one might reasonably wonder why it came in at the 11th hour at this point, why lots of his plans are coming in the 11th hour. So that speaks to the collapse of the Tory party, and that's sort of really where I want to focus in on, because I think that the collapse of the center right, at least in Europe, has been really, really troubling in terms of the rise of the further right. And we're starting to see that in the UK, but I'll refer us to I know that you've got some familiarity with Germany, but just to go back to Germany and what we think about that when Merkel when Merkel stepped back, there was a bit of a leadership crisis, if you will, in the Christian Democratic Party in Germany. And they weren't exactly sure who to put up there. One of their chosen candidates had a bit of a gaffe where they like were caught laughing or smiling at some like flood memorial situation that was going on. I'm not entirely sure. But either way, bad look. And they were struggling to find someone to replace Merkel. And so we had, then obviously Scholz ends up becoming chancellor, and because of that, or maybe not necessarily because of that, but after that we see Alternative for Germany, the far right party, really gaining a lot of ground that we didn't really see when Merkel was in power. It's safe to say that they've become increasingly popular. Since Scholz took over. I'm not saying that there's a direct causal link there, but I also think that the collapse of the center right is really dangerous because the center right might co-opt some of the positions of the further right, such that you don't need a further right party. But because the center left, or rather left of center in Germany is in power, you would see the Alternative for Germany taking bigger strides into the Bundestag, but also as we saw in the most recent European elections, the right was doing really well. And so I think to relate this back to the UK really quickly before I let you jump in for a sec is we see right now with even the Conservatives sort of admitting, hey, vote Conservative so we can avoid a Labour supermajority. Having a supermajority of a left of center, even I wouldn't call them a left wing. I wouldn't really call Labour a left wing party. But as we were mentioning, sort of a liberal party. that's concerning, and we see that in the polling data for Nigel Farage's Reform UK. I'm not sure that he's going to actually win a lot of seats because they don't elect proportionally there. They elect sort of first past the post. But at the same time, there are polls that show him at 16, 17, 18%, whereas at the conservatives hovering around, that 18, 19, 20. And so that tells me that the collapse of the center right is really giving some breeding ground to the far right. And as we saw in Europe, and particularly what we saw in France the other day with their elections, that is definitely a concern.
Yeah. I was really thinking about France there the whole time you were talking, because that is a very good point, and it's very interesting to see. Almost like the UK has been in this 14-year trapped in amber of just increasingly poor kind of center right, increasingly drifting right government, where the other countries in Europe, and I would say even the U.S. as well, have been really going quite a bit faster through this kind of dark political evolution. I would definitely say that you're going to see some sort of I would say just broadly center politics, center governments from the UK with the next at least 5 years. Excuse me, with Keir Starmer coming into power. But then, as you said, and I think very, very importantly, what the hell happens to, the Conservative Party when they get absolutely decimated and they essentially are essentially all tied up with Reform, which is a much more right-wing party where you had, their activists and their candidates get caught on tape calling the Prime Minister, who is obviously an Indian guy, a racial slur. So like that, and among many other things, and Nigel Farage, the leader of that party, being pretty slow to condemn it to, at least when he had a town hall, as they call it, a question time over there, he was really pretty beat up with called racist, 6 different ways to Sunday. So hopefully that kind of speaks to the willingness of the UK to kind of not engage with that stuff. But if I personally would be not entirely comfortable, I guess I would say, with a government that Keir Starmer is trying to in a time where the UK really needs some radical change. They're going to have the perfect opportunity to do it. They have had some incredibly bad growth. The investments that they have made have been incredibly ineffective, and it seems to be a very kind of neoliberal outlook from Keir Starmer going forward. Which is what we've seen have really these kind of declining standards of living, if they don't start to go up on the rise pretty soon, and Nigel Farage is able to kind of clean up his act a little bit, it's easy to see with a governance style like Keir Starmer what he has, some sort of rise of the far right in the next election, and definitely something to follow, definitely something like we've seen in France. But kind of the hopeful side of that is I guess we could say is the far lefts. And France has kind of arisen to fight that out of the ashes of what seems to be at this point Macron's kind of centrist party. I know, Justin, you probably would have more to say. We could probably continue this conversation for much, much longer, but we're going to have to stop it there. 1 hour, 42 minutes. But yeah, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you on, Justin. Thank you so much for doing this today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's been a blast.
All right, that's it for us. Back at least once throughout this holiday weekend. Enjoy your 4th of July, and I'm sure me and Justin will both be watching the fireworks in more ways than one, both at home and across the pond with the UK election on Thursday.